Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. One way of achieving that mission is listening to experts discuss pressing local, national, and international issues. Before COVID struck, concerned citizens met regularly to hear these experts. After COVID arrived, concerned citizens turned to Zoom, video recording talks, panels, and debates for later broadcast on this channel. Now that COVID is in remission, our main menu is again in-person meetings. But for those of you unable to join us, Village TV is video recording our in-person speakers for later broadcast on this program. In addition, when the right opportunity comes along, Concerned Citizens Presents will continue to offer the occasional remote speaker. We hope you enjoy today's program.
It is such a pleasure to introduce David Korn tonight. He'll be discussing his new book. It just came out a couple days ago. It's called American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy. Those of you who follow David's award-winning reporting as Washington Bureau Chief of Mother Jones, or see his commentary on MSNBC, or have read any of his previous books about American politics and culture, will not be surprised that American Psychosis clears the highest bar for narrative nonfiction and political journalism. Put simply, it is a great book. It really, really is good. And I just want to say it is kind of essential reading in this time and an easy read, even though it's dealing with a very broad and difficult subject. So I hope you'll read it, and I hope you'll get all your family and friends to read it. It's that important a book. You also probably know, if you follow politics, that in the last few years, a slew of reporters and writers have tried to explain the rise of Donald Trump. Our shelves are filled with really, really good books looking at different aspects of Trump and Trumpism, as depressing as that is to some of us. And more recently, journalists have begun examining the Republican Party itself, a party that's given up any pretense of rationality and moderation to embrace white supremacy, Christian nationalism, conspiracism, and violent extremism. And David explains in American Psychosis that the roots of extremism in today's Republican Party have been there all along, as the party has evolved from the party of Lincoln to the party of Trump. While riven with divisions between moderates and fringes throughout its history, the GOP also has exhibited certain patterns over decades. A reliance on fear and paranoia as a way of galvanizing voters, an assault on truth and evidence, and perhaps most alarming, the complicity of mainstream Republican leaders who kowtow to extremists for political gain. How did a party whose ideas are outdated, unpopular with the public, and represent a minority of the electorate accrue so much power over decades? How are we now at risk of a true tyranny of the few? David's book gives us not only the origin story, but the full history of how we've ended up with the GOP of today. If you watch TV or read about books, you'll know that American Psychosis is already getting much deserved attention and rave reviews. David's been on MSNBC this week. Rachel Maddow, if you were watching on Monday night when she does her show, plugged the book a couple nights ago, saying that David tackles his subject in, quote, his irreducible, ineffable David Korn way. She calls David's book a cautionary tale and notes that it is a super readable modern history of the right. She is right about all of that, and who can say it better than Rachel Maddow? Definitely not me. So with that, I just want to reiterate what an honor it is to host the event. We're in for a wonderful discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming David Korn to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's not a book launch without an event at Politics and Prose. I feel that quite personally. I feel my kids, I have two adult daughters now, but they grew up here. And I have just tremendously fond memories of being a floor below and spending time with them exploring and getting some guidance from your expert sales force down there. So it really means a lot for me to be here. So I thank you. I thank all of you who came. I also want to thank Book TV and C-SPAN for being here. I've said this for years. C-SPAN is one of the greatest public services we have in this country, and I am always, always honored to be associated with it. As Alyssa said, I will Let's see, is this better for you? Okay. Okay, good. Okay for C-SPAN? All right. As I hope you heard most of that. I won't repeat it. As Alyssa said, I will talk for a little bit, and then we'll take some questions, and we'll ask people to come up here. I'm sure there are a lot of great questions out there, but everybody should have a question in mind, because if there aren't, I will start calling on people. So just to be safe, think of something. So I'm going to start by asking you to ponder this. A presidential candidate or president who validates the conspiracy theory that high government officials are actively trying to destroy the United States from within. Or one who encourages paranoid kooks to believe the media, colleges, corporations, libraries, PTAs are being run by America's enemies. Or one who takes advantage of racism and forges alliances with white supremacists. Or think of one who embraces Christian nationalists, including those who say homosexuality can be and should be punished by execution. Or one who legitimizes a loony anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist who claims Jewish bankers, the Federal Reserve, the Trilateral Commission, secret societies, communists, and politicians around the globe are trying to impose a collectivist, one-world, totalitarian government on everyone for the benefit of Lucifer. Literally for Lucifer. Now, I'm not talking about Donald J. Trump. I'm talking about Dwight Eisenhower, Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Okay, those descriptions each describe or apply to one of those past Republican leaders. And the point of the book, American Psychosis, is to present a history of the GOP's 7 decades long relationship with far-right fanaticism. The book chronicles how the Republican Party, and again, its leaders, have exploited and embraced extremism, bigotry, racism, paranoia, and conspiracy theory to win elections. So what we're seeing these days with Donald Trump and the Trumpified Republican Party is not something new or radically different. It's a continuation. It's not an aberration. Maybe it's the culmination, but also maybe it's going to lead to something worse than what we have today. So basically, it didn't start with Trump. Now, let me talk about how I got into this in the first place. A little over a year ago, I was thinking about where we were with Trumpism, the Republican Party. And I said there must be a book out there that sort of describes the far right and its influence on the Republican Party over the years. And I went looking, and I found no such book. So kind of like Be the Change You Want to Be, write the book you want to read. That's what I did. So I thought there was really an opening here. And it seemed kind of obvious to me. I was kind of surprised that no one else had taken this up before. There were a lot of good books that touched on the subject. Some of you might have read some of Rick Perlstein's political histories, which are magnificent. They cover a wider swath of territory than just the right and the Republican Party, and they happen to end in 1980. I'm sure he's working on other editions. And there's the work of people like Richard Hofstadter, who wrote the style of paranoia, the political style of paranoia, and he wrote that in 1964. It still is tremendously relevant, but a lot has happened since then, right? So the book lays out the basic path here, and I'll give you sort of this thumbnail sketch. I go all the way back to the Salem witch trials, which is pretty far back, and there weren't any Republicans back then, but I really pick up the story with McCarthyism. In World War II, FDR devastated the Republican Party. It was almost blown to smithereens. I won't remember the exact numbers now, but I don't know, they were like 10 or 12 or a dozen or so Republican senators and a very small number of House Republicans. And it really looked like the party, between the New Deal and having been basically isolationist, and having been affiliated with the Roaring Twenties that led to the Great Depression, had no standing any longer. And it was basically in the late 40s that it started doing something new. And it didn't pioneer this. Red baiting, communist hunting had been around for several decades, and Democrats had been involved in it too. It was pretty bipartisan up to that point. But they started using it to attack the Democrats. Richard Nixon was an early adapter, as we would say today, in this disruptive type of politics. It got him elected to the House and then up to the Senate. But it was Joe McCarthy who leapfrogged over Richard Nixon in the Algiers Hiss case to make McCarthyism, but to make the Red Scare a moral panic. And it really was taking advantage of what was real unease at the time. The Cold War had come down after World War II. Americans didn't know how to deal with the new nuclear terror that hovered over everybody. And McCarthy came up with a pretty simple solution. There was a small band of evil men running the U.S. government from the highest ranks of the elite, who were actively engaged in weakening the United States so the Soviet Union would take it over. It wasn't that their policies were wrong or misguided. They were actively doing this. He gave a speech in which he said it was a conspiracy so immense. And he said, it's hard to believe that elites would do this to their own country. But it's happened before in human civilization. Now, it's basically QAnon without the baby eating, or the sex trafficking, or the basement at Comet Pizza next door, right? But it's the same thing, and it follows conspiracy theory through the ages. My book talks about other uses of conspiracy theory in American politics before this, but it was like the grand one. And the Republican Party saw him winning elections and helping other Republicans win elections with this demonization of Democrats, liberals, progressives, pointy-headed bureaucrats here in Washington, D.C., and they rallied to it. And there is what I think is a pivotal moment. When I was on Morning Joe earlier this week, Joe zeroed in on this moment too, which I found very, very interesting. When Dwight David Eisenhower, war hero, president of Columbia University, campaigning in 1952 for presidency, was barely a Republican. He picked one of the Republican Party right before he decided to run. He could have been a Democrat. But he's running, and Joe McCarthy is up for re-election. And they're campaigning together in Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. And Eisenhower knew that McCarthy was a liar and a scoundrel, and the fact that McCarthy had pegged George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff in World War II, Eisenhower's close comrade in arms, who then who saved the United States, then saved Europe with the Marshall Plan, and then became Secretary of Defense for Truman. And McCarthy had identified him as the leader of this secret cabal that wanted to sell out America to the Soviet Union and to the Reds. Eisenhower, of course, didn't like this. And he knew he was wrong. And he knew that McCarthy was crazy. This is what today we would call crazy talk. And he asked a speechwriter to put a paragraph in a speech that he was going to give at the end of a day of whistle-stop touring on a train with McCarthy. And that speech was going to be at Marquette University, McCarthy's alma mater, which was going to be the big rally at the end of this day of campaigning together. And that speech was going to have this paragraph that defended George C. Marshall and attacked people who made baseless charges. Wouldn't name McCarthy, but everybody would know that it was him. So on the train, word starts to spread that this draft exists. Well, the governor of Wisconsin, a Republican, the head of the RNC, the Republican Party, who was on the train, and Sherman Adams, the Republican governor of New Hampshire, who was Eisenhower's close advisor and chief of staff, all panic. You can't do this. We might not win Wisconsin. And more importantly, McCarthy was attracting millions of Catholics to the Republican Party, which once had been anti-Catholic, and Catholics had been part of the Democratic base. But Catholics are stridently, largely anti-Catholic, some from East Europe for good reason. They were anti-communist because of their origins. And they didn't want to blow this new movement of Catholics into the Republican Party. And they went to Eisenhower, and Sherman Adams did, and explained this, and Eisenhower said, take it out. He gave a speech that night that in some ways affirmed McCarthyism, and the Milwaukee Journal said that this was McCarthyism light, what he said in terms of about rooting out Reds and everything. Joe Scaro picked up on this moment from the book, and he said Eisenhower was his hero. And when he reads this story, it disheartens him. He now realizes that, this might have been a pivotal moment when someone who had standing could have said, no, we're going off the rails here. We're not going to do this. Now, eventually, the Republican Party, half of the Republican senators voted to censure Joe McCarthy 4 years later or so. And, they say, look what we did. We got rid of McCarthy. Well, only half voted for that, and others still continued to red bait. But I think that kind of got them into this groove because it really did seem to work. And then you have Goldwater in '64 working hand in glove with the John Birch Society, which was McCarthyism on steroids. I mean, very much equivalent. If you read their stuff from back then, it sounds just like QAnon stuff today. And there's this whole myth that William F. Buckley excommunicated the Birchers from the Republican and conservative movements. And that happened in '65, but in the early '60s, he was plotting with Goldwater to figure out how to criticize the head of the JBS, the John Birch Society, without alienating the society itself and the members, because they wanted those people on their ranks knocking on doors and giving money and being basically the ground troops. And so they cut a deal in a lot of ways, and Goldwater won the '64 nomination in part because of his alliance with the John Birch Society and not denouncing them. Nixon cut a deal with white supremacists in 1968. He worried about Ronald Reagan, gaining the upper hand at the convention. He was governor at that point, Reagan was. And he cut a deal with Strom Thurmond. And he told John Mitchell, his campaign manager, to tell Thurmond and other Southern delegates that if he got the nomination and became president, there'd be no more pro-Negro crap. His words. So here's the guy who, in 1960, was campaigning for the black vote, which was the traditional part of the Republican base. Now in '68, dumping it for the South and cutting a deal with white supremacists. And he even had the audacity when he got the nomination to say, I've gotten this nomination without cutting a single deal. That's Nixon. You move up to Reagan and the late '70s, and he embraced the new right and the religious right. This was the rise of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell was telling Americans that gay people wanted to kill Americans, and destroy Christianity, and the whole religious right movement was fed by this Christian nationalism that included people in the moral majority and elsewhere. I'm talking about officials, top-ranking members, who said that homosexuality was an affront to God, and homosexual people could be executed according to God's word. This was not, an unusual thing for a moral majority person to say. And Ronald Reagan is out there praising the moral majority. George H.W. Bush, same thing. He claimed to be kinder and gentler, but he needed the Christian Coalition. And the Christian Coalition was led by Pat Robertson, who I referred to earlier, not by name, who literally wrote a book saying the Jewish baking family was part of a satanic conspiracy with Henry Kissinger and the Trilateral Commission and all the rest to win the world over for Satan. And in that book, he called George H.W. Bush one of the accomplices of this satanic plot. Months later, George H.W. Bush goes to the Christian Coalition Conference and praises Pat Robertson. Now, this is part of a pattern. The pattern is legitimizing the crazy, the extremism. It's one thing to be extreme in terms of a policy. You're an absolutist on abortion, say, no exceptions, and that's a policy decision, and one can have a debate over this. But the extremism that I talk about in the book is extremism that's based on irrationality, fear, demagoguery, often bigotry and racism, and hatred. And again and again and again, the Republican Party is getting into bed with these forces, and they're encouraging them and exploiting them, but basically legitimizing them. And George W. Bush, compassionate conservative, started his campaign kind of taking a step away from the hard right, the far right. And as soon as he got into trouble, when John McCain beat him in the New Hampshire primary, and it looked like his gigantic machinery could just collapse, with all the money he had and all the endorsements, he ran to South Carolina. He energized the Christian Coalition, and he went to Bob Jones University, where they banned interracial dating and marriage, and they believed that Catholicism was equivalent to Satanism. So they were anti-Catholic bigots and racists. And he gave a speech there to rally the troops to keep John McCain at bay. John McCain gave a speech saying this party should not be defined or even identify with Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and other religious extremists. That's what John McCain said. He lost. He lost that race in South Carolina, and his stand against extremism backfired for him. It again showed the strength within the Republican base of these extremist forces. So that brings us, I've skipped the whole Newt Gingrich in the 90s, which is a book that Alyssa's working on, and you'll get that probably in a couple of weeks, right? What? Julian Zeliger. So we'll leave Newt to the side for a second, and Vince Foster conspiracies and Rush Limbaugh, but the Republican Party embraced all that craziness in the 90s. A lot of us lived through that. But from, Bush a few years later, remember Sarah Palin? Okay, so John McCain, who in 2000 takes kind of a principled stand, no extremists. He picks Sarah Palin, and Sarah Palin gets out there, and she, basically picks up the birther theme that Obama pals around with terrorists. He's not a real American. He wants to bring a socialist tyranny, these are her words, to America. And you remember those rallies when people stood up and they shouted, communist at Obama, kill him, treason, traitor. And people would approach John McCain and say, well, he's really a secret Muslim, isn't he? Right. And we got to do something about that. Why did that happen? John McCain's campaign told Sarah Palin to make an issue out of Obama palling around with a terrorist, which was an inaccurate charge. So they totally flip. He totally flips. But again, they're unleashing the furies. And those rallies at the time, as a reporter going there and talking to other political journalists who were covering these events, they were unprecedented in the amount of visceral hatred that you would see at a presidential campaign event. I mean, it kind of looks charming now. It's kind of quaint, these people with their little hammers and sickles. Yeah. But at the time, it was kind of scary. And it really felt like something was changing. And then from that, we get the Tea Party just the next year, where the essence of the Tea Party, if you went to the rallies or you listened to Glenn Beck every night on Fox TV, It was that Barack Obama was a secret socialist Muslim born in Kenya who had a secret plan to wreck the American economy so he could then impose a totalitarian dictatorship and be emperor. And as part of that, there were the death panels. And if you survived a death panel, they were building concentration camps for you. I mean, this was literally said every night on Fox News. Not maybe literally, but many nights. And, you know, again, the point here is not that there's crazy out there. The point is that John Boehner, Sarah Palin, and many other establishment Republicans were going on Glenn Beck's show, legitimizing these views, telling these voters that you should heed this person, just the way they did with Rush Limbaugh a few years earlier when he was passing off Vince Foster conspiracies and climate change conspiracies and all sorts of forms of extremism. They are out there saying this is the way the world works. So my point is that through all this, we get to Trump. It's not each step along the way is not a tremendous distance from where it began. And we shouldn't be surprised if you just, look. Newt Gingrich said that the Democrats were radical anti-Americans who hated children and not normal people. And then Sarah Palin comes along and says they're not real Americans and they're in part of this conspiracy, and Glenn Beck makes it worse. And then the Tea Party. And you got to think, okay, 2016, you have 15 establishment Republicans and Donald Trump and Bobby Jindal and Jeb Bush are arguing about who has a better tax policy. And what about your housing plan, about education? And what are you going to do, Rick Perry, about capital gains? And think about the Republican Party base. You've just spent decades telling them that there's a secret Democratic plot with George Soros and the media and everybody in this room to destroy America. Not that they're wrong, that they want to destroy America purposefully. And you guys are arguing about capital gains rates? So you keep throwing people red meat and it doesn't make them into vegans. They just want more and more blood. And Donald Trump saw that. And he didn't do anything that hadn't been done somewhat before, but he did it in a louder way. He intensified it. He pushed the envelope even further, and he got rid of all the nicety. He was like, I don't care about policy. I'm not, infrastructure, but I have no plan. Healthcare, yeah, but I have no plan. And it was all about hating Muslims, going on Alex Jones's show, telling him he was a great American, much he liked him, playing to racism, misogyny as well. And how did he get there in the first place? As a champion of birtherism, a racist conspiracy theory. So the reason why I think this is all important is that you can't really know where to go if you don't know how you got to where you are, right? And when I started writing this book, I never really expected it to be as timely and relevant as I dare say think it has become in recent weeks, as we've had a national debate or conversation about MAGA extremism and whether Trump is or is not leading the country towards fascism or perhaps only semi-fascism, right? But I think to fully understand this moment, you need to sort of look at what's come up, because there are some people out there. Even Nancy Pelosi said this a few months ago. She said, I just want to go back to the good old Republican Party. That's what we need, to go back to the good old Republican Party, the way it used to be. And I think that if you understand the history, and I know why she said it, there's a good political reason to say that, but if you really understand the history, you see there was never such a thing as the good old Republican Party. The Stark side was always there. The party didn't want to acknowledge it, and the media has always undercovered it. In fact, in 1980, during that campaign, Jimmy Carter tried once or twice to raise the issue of Ronald Reagan's connections to extremism. The moral majority was running ads saying that Jimmy Carter was not a good Christian. Sunday school teaching Jimmy Carter not a good Christian, and that he had betrayed the South. Jimmy Carter, son of South. And they were spending millions of dollars, which was real money back in those days, to brand him this way. And as an ally, and they were being supported by Ronald Reagan as they were doing this. Jimmy Carter, in a very overly polite, subtle way, would say, I think there's some extremism going on in this campaign. And the media jumped on him and said, what, are you calling Reagan a racist? You're being mean. Are you being mean again? It sounds like you're being mean. And his campaign got cold feet, and they backed away from discussing this issue. It's a really good case study that I don't remember from the time of the media and the political media world not really being able to absorb what is a very uncomfortable truth. I mean, the way we like to think of things is that there's one side and the other side, and they fight it out, and they're not all that different, although sometimes one side goes a little too far. That there's sort of a polite society, and we're all in it together. But there's really been an asymmetry. And even, and Joe Scarborough and I discussed this the other day. There is no example that you can give me of a top, and put Trump to the side, because I keep saying he's not exceptional. But there's no example you can give me of a high-ranking Democrat, a presidential candidate, a national Democratic leader who embraces something like the Tea Party, a conspiratorial, paranoid, racist-driven force. It just doesn't exist. There was no John Birch Society equivalent on the left that Lyndon Johnson rounded up into his campaign. These things don't exist. It's not tit for tat. And the media has a really hard time, I think we all do, thinking that one side is radically different than the other side. So I'm hoping that my book, in a way, informs the conversations we have now. If you understand the deep roots of this, you can't just trim back the tree and think it's all going to be better. This has been an inexorable progress to this point in time. And you got to figure out a new direction rather than going back to something that didn't exist. So I hope it informs our thinking about what to do in this moment of crisis, and that in some ways, and I've seen this with other interviews, leads to a degree of revisionism on the Republican side. So Republicans, the few who have broken with Trump, who see the dangers of Trump, the never-Trumpers out there, I call them recovering Republicans, mainly on Twitter, and they're not few of them are elected, understand that a party that they've been a part of is responsible for what's happened. It's not just one guy. Trumpism would exist without Trump. He detonated it in a certain way. But what he did was built on what the party has done for many years. So, history compels us towards reckonings, and we've seen that recently. And we're still, dealing with slavery is obviously an example for us in the United States. And I think there is a reckoning here, and I think Biden's speech has clarified it a bit. There's a reckoning for Republicans, and there's a reckoning for those in the media and historians and others who haven't emphasized this aspect of recent political history. So I'm hoping that my book contributes to that. I'm glad you said it was a good and easy, keyword, easy read, because I try to tell the story through stories and anecdotes, and there's a lot of stuff there that I was alive for. I might even covered at the time. I completely forgot. And it's the type of thing, and I'll finish with this point, that the pattern looks so obvious once you start to look for it. I mean, as I said, I lived through a lot of this, and when I started doing the book, it was like, this stuff is just hiding in plain sight. We're just repeating this over and over, different iterations. But it's the same force. It's the same strategy. And no one's put a name to it, and this is, why we have Trump. It's why we have January 6th. It's why we have a party now that is supporting a man who says that if he is elected again, he's considered giving pardons to hundreds of people convicted of beating cops in order to stop the peaceful transfer of power in the United States. It is frightening stuff, but I try to write about it in a breezy way so that people can actually absorb this and learn about it and think about it and have the conversations we need to have. So with that, I'll stop pontificating and I'll ask for questions again so that all your great questions are captured clearly by C-SPAN and others recording. Please come up to the microphone here, and I do this every time and it never works. Please, questions, not speeches. I get to make the speech, but please, let's make them questions so we can get a few in.
Hi. I teach can you hear me?
Yeah.
I teach a class on the Wild West.
Oh, cool.
And it's cowboys and Indians and homesteaders and saloon fights and cattle drives and all of that. A lot of people don't really understand the era, and they don't understand its good points and its bad points. I end the course at Frederick Jackson Turner, who sort of summarized the whole experience as being heroic and molding our character and all of that. But one of the things that's consistent is the loneliness of the prairie and the wilderness and people who live there, and always wondering that something over the horizon might come, either a herd of buffalo or some outlaws or something, so that you had to have a gun to protect yourself, and that everyone that was over that horizon, maybe in the cities,
Right.
Was potentially evil and dangerous, and I wonder whether is my conclusion anywhere close? And is in fact, because we're getting more urban and less rural, is this psychosis maybe going to end?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of good books and a lot of good studies of what you might call the American character, right? Are there things that make our country or any other country different from another country? Are there national values, national principles, national styles, and national character? And I mean, I think that you can trace a lot to the size of America. Our transportation system affects our culture, right? Over the years, we have more space than European countries. And this sort of idealized American, the go-it-alone American, the do-it-yourself American, pioneering, going out to the wilderness, which, a lot of Americans did, but it was still a minority. It wasn't most Americans stayed in the cities and stayed in the suburbs and didn't go out and do this. But, it creates this myth that is very powerful, and then it gets attached to a policy like, what do you do with guns, right? And I do think that, it maybe overlaps with some of what I'm talking about, but it is kind of a separate thing at a different point in time in the shaping of America. Now, this is before the, mass culture, before both world wars, before the Depression, before the Great Migration from the South up to the North, and the immigration from Europe. So it's a very particular point in time. It sounds fascinating, and I'm a big fan of Deadwood. So I love thinking about the development of that part of America, and it was crucial to the beginning of the Republican Party, because it was formed to stop the spread of slavery until the Western territories. But I think certainly some of our gun culture comes out of that, and particularly how that affected probably popular culture, right? All the myths of cowboys and the westerns, and the go-it-alone silent American who takes care of himself, and it really cuts into the notion of a communal country, which often is, which is the opposite of tribalism, which is what McCarthy and Tea Party and everybody else and Trump have been exploiting, this notion of tribalism. There is an evil tribe out there, and it's not over the horizon. they're right, now it's at the border, but it's also in the cities. It's taking over our institutions. So in that sense, the idea of a threat and being ever on your guard and reinforcing the notion of tribalism from those days, that probably does flow into some of the stuff that I write about.
I was surprised. The only thing that really surprised me about what you said was Eisenhower. I was born in the 40s, and I was still a little girl in the 1950s, and I lived in Massachusetts. But my impression as an adult reading, Eisenhower has improved a lot since I was a little girl. He's been seen to have been much more sophisticated and much more active. We always thought he was just golfing.
Yeah.
But my sense is that he understood about McCarthy, that he was against McCarthy, that he had to wait until the time was right and he could get McCarthy. But that he didn't believe any of this stuff.
No, that is all true, what you just said. He hated McCarthy, but he refused to call him out by name, thinking that would only give McCarthy, this is when he was president, that would only give McCarthy more stature. And he also thought it would turn some Republicans against him and make it harder for him to get what he wanted to get through Congress. There were plenty of advisors who told him, you got to stop him now. Before anything, and it was only when he went after the Army and the famous "Have you no decency, sir" hearing happened that everybody turned on McCarthy. But I focused on when Eisenhower was trying to get elected, and he made this deal. He would not say what he believed, and he saw the danger of McCarthyism, and he kept quiet because he was convinced that would hurt his electoral chances. Now, when McCarthy was censured, 56, 57, Eisenhower quipped, McCarthyism is now McCarthy-wasism, but it was really not true because there were still tremendous elements within the Republican Party who were saying the exact same thing as McCarthy, and of course the conservative movement declared McCarthy a martyr. People like William F. Buckley and L. Brent Brazell, they were out there defending him, long past his censure and into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So he never really was put completely aside. And again, half of the Republicans in the Senate didn't vote to censure him. So there was a little split there. And Eisenhower tried to walk the tight wire on that. And he eventually got to a good position. Not publicly, but internally.
Right.
But at first he didn't. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I just want to say that I've already devoured the book, and it is a fast read and a lickety split story, and very, very scary at the end, and very much worth reading. And when you get to the end, it's hard to feel anything but that we should be more partisan in a sense. That the divide is just too great. And so I just want to ask a very direct and straightforward question. How is your book going to help the Democrats?
Well, I didn't write it with the intention of helping any particular Democratic candidate. I have been writing over the past year that I thought we were in a moment of democratic crisis, small d, although it could be large D as well, but I was thinking of a small d democracy crisis, and that the Democrats needed to engage on this point rather vigorously. They have to let people know and try to convince the people who don't already see it that Trumpism poses a threat to the Republic, whether it was January 6th or what's happened since the desire to take over the vote counting, tabulating systems at the states, the denial of reality. If we can't have if we can't agree on some basics, we can't have a functioning democracy. So I've been thinking about that, and it seemed to me that really it was up to Biden. I mean, I hate to say that the world or history turns on a single person and his or her decision, but he is really the only one with a big enough microphone, megaphone, bully pulpit to try to affect that debate, or at least set the terms of that debate. And while I didn't think, my book would get him to do this, that, or anything in particular, I was hoping that it would clarify some of the lines of discussion here. And so this whole idea of, I mentioned earlier, and I don't mean to beat up on her, but Nancy Pelosi saying, can't we go back to the good old days, that you really need to know that that can't be the solution at this point, that the Republican Party in some ways is too far gone. And it sounds hyperbolic and partisan to say that, but if you look at the polling, more than half still believe the big lie, a lot still believe that Barack Obama was a Muslim, a lot idolize those who were arrested, and when Donald Trump says he would let them go, it's not an issue for Republicans, which of course encourages other people to do this should the opportunity arise again. So I think in some ways, understanding that we can't just have let's all be friends again and figure out how to go forward and go back to the good old days, should be useful to the Democrats, because if you can't do that, which I think is a very ineffectual way of doing that, then you have no choice but to come up with a much more vigorous analysis and be more forceful. And I thought Biden's speech, which I think, I know him a little bit. Everyone here has a sense of him. I think that's pretty accurate. He's not as, there's nothing very mysterious about Joe Biden, which I think is kind of charming. I think that was a hard speech for him to give. I really think he would like to be the great bringer together, the great uniter, and pass bipartisan legislation. That's what, the Lions of the Senate did, that he grew up admiring and that he tried to do in the past. I think it's very hard to say, you know what, I don't think that we can do that anymore. But I think that was the first step. I think he and Democrats have to continue to make that point, and hopefully if they're informed by history, they'll be so motivated.
I appreciate you describing this rising tide and the waves that keep coming in, and perhaps our inability to handle them right. I remember the John Birch Society and arguing with a Sunday school teacher of mine. The counters were calling it the Birch John Society, funny, but didn't get to the real issues. The thing that concerns me, particularly after going out canvassing recently in Western Maryland, listening to one person really upset because the Democrats are giving too much of our tax money to Ukrainian Nazis. Very vehement guy. One guy saying, get out of my parts, I'm going to go get my gun right now because you knocked on my door. And another very nice young woman caring for her 94-year-old aunt, who was upset because everything that's bad is now taken as good, and everything that's good is bad, and so she's got to vote her heart and vote all of these pieces. But then liking one thing that one Democrat does. And what concerns me, and I want your pictures, you've described the waves inside America. It seems to me we have more things coming in from outside America to fan the flames even beyond what we're able to do inside. And I wonder if you have any comments.
Well, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, what's happening in America is not unique to America. We see a tide of far-right extremism and intolerance happening throughout the world, particularly in Europe, which are countries that are more aligned to us in terms of history and principle. You see Meloni, who praised Mussolini, who it seems to be heading to be the next prime minister of Italy. You see Viktor Orban in Hungary using very fascistic-like language and attacking migrants and tolerance and diversity, and being feted here by Tucker Carlson and CPAC and the whole conservative movement. They see him as a model. So there, and you have people like Steve Bannon who are actively trying to draw the lines and connections and alliances between these nationalist extremist forces in different countries. And at the same time, this was the subject of the last book I did with co-author Michael Isikoff, Russian Roulette. You have Putin trying to take advantage of this, as he did with the attack on the 2016 election. And just yesterday, there was a news story that came out. There was an intelligence report that he has spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to help far-right extremist parties and politicians and media outlets throughout the world. And this was something that, we reported on in 2018 that he had been up to for a number of years. So there are a lot of tensions here in the country that are very easily inflamed, and they're easily inflamed by Donald Trump. They're easily inflamed by QAnon conspiracy theory websites. They're easily inflamed by grifters who want to raise money off this. I mean, I get, I'm on all the Republican conservative mailing lists, and I get literally dozens of emails a day about this conspiracy or that conspiracy, or that basically say Joe Biden is in league with Antifa, Black Lives Matter, radical communists, all to destroy suburban America, meaning white America, right? Let's be honest. And this stuff must work to some degree because it keeps on coming. So I think there's this tremendous exploitation of these tensions and fears and grievances and irrationality and ignorance. I mean, I have to put it that way in some quarters. And you just look at all the different conspiracy theories that came out with the big lie that China was working with the CIA, working with Venezuela to create bamboo paper ballots and 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 mules running around. And they all did this without anyone being caught. On camera, on tape, anyone confessing. I mean, these conspiracies that they conjure up involve tens of thousands of people. And anybody who's been in Washington knows that you can't get 5 people to do anything all at once in the right way. I mean, that's true just in general in the state of human affairs. So, but it sort of takes a certain ignorance of the world and the way institutions work to believe some of these outrageous tales.
I enjoyed your reference to history in trying to learn from history to what we should be doing. I remember that one of the memorable lines from Teddy Roosevelt is the idea that the rich hate me, I welcome their hatred. So I'm wondering that in fact stronger rhetoric on the part of Democrats, kind of along the lines that we heard from Biden, this last speech that he did about democracy is that peril and so on, may not actually be one of the ways in which we ought to go forward, in that perhaps what needs to be done strategically is sort of raise the level of concern and perhaps fear among the Democrats to go to the vote, to the polls and vote and so on. So that's one lesson from history. The other one is I was thinking about a book by I think Matthew Stewart, The Heretical Origins of the American Republic. It's a very interesting book in that actually we had a very large evangelical community in the United States, and yet the fathers of revolution were able to put together a very thoughtful and extremely progressive at the time document. And the question is, how was that possible? I mean, trying to learn from history is, So those are my two questions.
Well, those are both great questions. I'm not familiar with the book you cited, but I do know that a lot of the early politics of the American Republic were based on how much control and power evangelical Protestants would have. It was that whether Sabbath laws and the power of the clergy in political races. It was very rooted. I mean, those first couple of decades, that was a key part of the debates going on between Adams and Jefferson and other elements in the society. You can go back and look at the Declaration and the Constitution and find like a lot of different ways why this should not have worked, and a lot of compromises that were made that are that haunted the country afterwards. So they got some things right, but not everything right. And it obviously has, as we've learned now, there are sort of imperfections with that. We have, while at the time it might have made sense to give every state 2 senators, at this point in time, that's probably not how you would start, a functioning democracy, right? I'm not an expert on how they pulled it off and got the things that they got right, how they got it right. But I do think that, they were dealing with a lot of differences and very stark differences at the time. And so it might be worthwhile to go back and look at that. But on your question about rhetoric, it's really a hard thing to do. Let's just look at what we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. Is this fascism or not fascism, right? Now, if you call someone a fascist, it sounds extreme. It sounds partisan. It sounds hyperbolic. And a lot of Americans who are not as politically involved as I assume a lot of people in this room are, don't like messy politics. They don't really like name calling. It may work if they see a negative ad. It may work on them, but they don't like it. And they don't, and they really do want to believe we could just go to Washington and make things work. It's kind of what a lot of them want. So if you get out there and say the other side is, there's elements of fascism there is a recoiling, and I understand that. But at the same time, when you have a force that wants to overthrow an election and protect people who are engaging in violence, which is to get a political end, which is one definition of terrorism, what do you do? How do you call that out? And how, and given our culture where, on a good night, Fox will get a couple million viewers and Dancing with the Stars gets 27 million and CNN gets maybe 500,000. I mean, how do you reach people and who are not already concerned? Can you do it just by saying we need to have a reasonable conversation about this? Do you have to do it with harder hitting rhetoric? I mean, I do think we've seen with Biden's speech that, that was hard hitting for him. And it was hard hitting for a lot of Americans. It was like, Hillary saying the deplorables, right? And when she said that, I think she was wrong in terms of saying half are deplorables, probably more like 33%. But that, people didn't want to, she got eaten alive for that. So I think it's a hard thing to do, to figure out how to tell the truth, how to call out something that is indeed a threat, get people's attention, and not look like you're hysterical. Because no one likes anyone who's hysterical. And that's, that takes, that's very hard. And the other side, they don't have this obligation. Trump is out there saying that Biden wants to bring about fascism, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, yada, yada, yada. So, and people go, well, that's Trump, and his people love that. So he has no, limitations on his ability to do that. Biden, who wants to govern, wants to be reasonable, it's a lot tougher.